What would you do if someone offered you a ticket to heaven? In 2023, Netflix's documentary In the Name of God, A Holy Betrayal shocked viewers worldwide. The series exposed 4 Korean religious leaders who proclaimed themselves prophets, revealing their systematic abuse, crimes, and cover-ups. The documentary helped break the cycle of abuse for victims still trapped under these leaders' control. But a similar horror was unfolding on the other side of the world, one that remains largely unknown to international media. This time, the victims were underage boys, and the abuse happened in a place that promised them paradise. This is the story of the Agam Islamic boarding school sexual abuse case, where more than 40 young boys were sexually assaulted by their religious leaders under the guise of God's calling. This case shocked Indonesia, but never received the international attention it deserved. So let's begin. It started like any other night. An unnamed boy, let's call him A, was woken from his sleep by his teacher, who said he needed help. His mentor, let's call him RA here, asked for a massage. This wasn't entirely unusual. The Islamic boarding school where A lived, MTI Kanduangin Agam, West Sumatra, offered massage services to support its finances. So usually A would massage clients around afternoon or evening prayers. But this time RA told him to be ready at 1 a.m. And something felt wrong, but A couldn't refuse. The person giving orders was his mentor, someone he was taught to obey without question. Another boy, B, was also summoned. The two were told to sleep in the living room while waiting, something that had never happened before. When the clock struck 1 a.m., RA began to undress. He ordered the boys to remove their clothes as well. He touched their bodies, moving from their hands to more private areas. He told A to open his legs so he could penetrate him. A and B tried to resist. They screamed and fought back. But Ari's words stopped them cold. I could make you fail your classes. Your parents will be disappointed. Do as I say, or else. Fear paralyzed them. No matter how hard they screamed, no one came to help. The boys stood frozen, and RA interpreted their silence as consent, but silence never means yes. What should have been an hour felt like an eternity. A and B tried to give each other strength, hoping the abuse would end or someone would intervene. But no one came. When he finished, RA approached the traumatized boys, looked them in the eyes, and grinned. Never tell anyone. Swear. Swear in the name of God that you will never tell a soul about tonight. They had no choice but to not. And this was just the beginning. The abuse would eventually involve more than 40 male students, a number that would grow to 43, then 45, as the investigation deepened. The institution that promised to teach boys about heaven had become their hell. A week passed, A and B tried to recover, doing their best to appear normal. But just when they thought RA had lost interest, he called for A again. Same place, same hour. A knew what awaited him, but what could he do? In an environment where the abuser holds power and commands respect, as a pious teacher, who would believe a student's accusations? The abuse continued. RA no longer limited himself to his private room. He began touching A in open spaces, pretending concern while groping his thighs and body. Eventually, A reached his breaking point. He decided to tell someone. In boarding schools like this, students are prohibited from using modern technology. Phones are strictly limited. Only a few days each month can students call their parents. When phone day finally arrived, A had his chance. But as the phone rang, hesitation gripped him. What if his mother didn't believe him? What if his father felt disgusted that his son had been dirtied by those touches? Paralyzed by fear, A couldn't confess. Instead, he begged his parents to let him live alone in a rented room. It didn't matter if it was cheap or small, as long as he didn't have to live in the boarding school. But his parents, lacking explanation for this sudden request, refused. They feared the free lifestyle outside the boarding school, afraid their son might fall into darkness and temptation. They never realized the boarding school itself was killing them inside. A didn't give up. 3 days later, he called again with the same desperate request. Again, his parents failed to understand. Another rejection. On July 11th, around 3 a.m., RA woke A once more and demanded a massage. A tried to refuse, even attempting to run away. But RA grabbed his hands, squeezing tightly. He smiled and looked into A's eyes. "You will obey me, right?" That night ended like all the others, with A crying and pleading for help that never came. Days passed with RA continuing to give him predatory glances and inappropriate touches. Finally, on July 21st, A called his parents again. This time, he told them everything. How RA talked to him, how he looked at him with lust, how he forced A to undress and spread his legs to satisfy his wicked desires. His mother broke down in tears. His father couldn't believe what he was hearing. Guilt consumed them. They had failed to protect their son, failed to believe his earlier pleas. Run. That single word was all A needed. Without taking anything, A fled the boarding school, sneaking out of the building that had sheltered him for years. He walked more than 10 kilometers to Bukit Tinggi, where he contacted his brother's friends for help. In a safe location, he told his brother everything. Rage consumed his brother, who wanted to confront the teacher immediately, but friends restrained him. Instead, they went to the police station. On July 21st, 2024, a pair of parents arrived at the station, tears streaming down their faces. They wanted nothing but justice for their child. Shortly after, 2 men were arrested. 29-year-old Ronald Anandi and 23-year-old Arif Abdullah. Both were teachers at the school who also served as dormitory supervisors. And what made this case particularly disturbing was their backgrounds. Both men were distinguished alumni of MTI Kanduang, top graduates who had achieved cum laude honors at university. Ronald was a respected religious figure, a well-known preacher frequently invited to deliver sermons at mosques across the region. He held the prestigious position of Murshid, a spiritual guide in Sufi Tariqat order. These were men the community trusted implicitly, men who represented the pinnacle of religious education and devotion. But beneath their pious exteriors lay a darker truth. Both had themselves been victims of sexual abuse in their past, a tragic illustration of how unaddressed trauma can perpetrate cycles of violence. To understand how this happened, you need to know about Indonesia's educational system and the unique world of pesantren. In Indonesia, there are 2 types of schools. First, conventional schools with standard curriculums that you'd recognize everywhere. Then there are religious-based schools that provide deep religious education. While Indonesia is predominantly Muslim, some families choose Christian schools. Those who enroll in Islamic schools often attend pesantren, Islamic boarding schools that combine religious education with standard middle and high school curricula. Students in pesantren spend their days reciting the Quran and learning Islamic principles. Because these are residential institutions, they must generate their own funding, and some rely on organizational backing, others develop income streams like farming or selling goods and services. At MTI Kanduang, one of those services was massage therapy, and on the surface, this seemed practical, students learning marketable skills. But behind this innocent facade lurked something sinister, 2 teachers' predatory obsession with young boys. The full story only emerged through the victim's lawyer, Mas Rizal. The abuse had occurred from 2022 to 2024, but only came to light in 2024 when A decided to speak up. According to testimony, RA's pattern was consistent. Wake students at night, request a massage, then assault them behind locked doors. The threats were always the same. Fail your classes, disappoint your parents, or worse, face divine punishment. The police moved quickly, which is rare for this type of case in Indonesia. They went to the boarding school and questioned RA about the allegations. And of course, he denied everything, claiming A was lying out of resentment for being scolded during class. But A wasn't alone. 30 male students came forward, each saying "Me too," sparking a movement within the institution. During extensive interviews, 10 more students revealed they had suffered similar abuse, not from RA, but from the other teacher, AA. Police traced the abuse back to 2022. It had continued for 2 years without intervention. As investigations deepened, the victim count rose from 40 to 43 and eventually to 45 students. The methods were nearly identical. Both men would wake students at night requesting massages. Once inside their rooms, doors would lock and the assault would begin. Among the 45 victims, 3 were sodomized, while 37 experienced inappropriate touching and molestation. Refusal meant failing grades or detention. Both men presented as straight. Both had families that appeared happy, beautiful wives, and children. However, police investigation revealed the two often spent nights together. Their actual sexuality was never confirmed. On July 22nd, arrest warrants were issued. RA and AA became suspects in 45 cases of sexual abuse. They were charged under laws regarding child protection, carrying a maximum sentence of 15 to 20 years. Both men were detained at Malporesta Bukit Tinggi, pending trial. As of the time the story was compiled, no information about their trial or sentencing has been made publicly available. This silence is troubling but not uncommon. While arrests and cases like this often receive media attention, the actual court proceedings and verdicts frequently go unreported, especially outside major Indonesian cities. The victims and their families are left waiting for the justice they were promised, while the perpetrators remain behind bars in legal limbo. Whether they have been tried, convicted, or sentenced remains unknown to the public. Before we look at how the public reacted, we need to understand something crucial about these perpetrators and why this abuse was able to continue for so long. So both RA, Ronald Anandi, and Arief Abdullah AA were products of the very system they would later exploit. They weren't outsiders who infiltrated the school. They were its success stories. Distinguished graduates, cum laude university students, the pride of MTI Kanduang. RA, Ronald especially, had built an impressive reputation. As a murshid in a Sufi tariqat order, he held one of the highest positions of religious authority. He was sought after, regularly invited to deliver sermons at mosques throughout the region. To the community, he embodied piety, knowledge, and spiritual authority. Parents entrusted their sons to his care, believing these boys would receive not just education, but moral and spiritual guidance from a man who seemed to walk closer to God than most. But police investigations revealed something that explained everything and nothing at all. Both men had themselves been victims of sexual abuse during their time as students. And let's think about that for a moment. The institution that failed to protect them as children later gave them positions of power over other children. The cycle was never broken. It was reinforced, institutionalized, and allowed to continue. This pattern isn't unique to MTI Kanduang. Research on sexual abuse in Indonesian pesantren reveals systemic issues rooted in power dynamics and institutional culture. The relationship between kiai, religious teachers, and santri, students in traditional pesantren, is built on a foundation of absolute obedience. Students are taught that disobeying their religious teachers is tantamount to disobeying God himself. Imagine being a child in that environment. The person abusing you isn't just your teacher, he's a spiritual guide. A murshid, someone positioned as an intermediary between you and God. When he tells you that speaking out would be a sin, when he makes you swear on Allah's name to keep silent, when he threatens you with both earthly failure and divine punishment, who would you believe has more power? A child's word against a man who speaks for God. This is how religious authority becomes a weapon. The sacred and the institutional intertwine into mechanisms of control. It's not just, I'll fail you in class. It's, you will go to hell. It's not just, don't tell anyone. It's, swear in the name of God. And here's another layer. Both perpetrators were married with families. They lived openly in school housing with their wives. They held official positions as teachers and dormitory supervisors. Their respectability was their camouflage. Who would suspect the devoted husband and father, the man who leads prayers and gives sermons, the teacher who graduated with honors? Their wives' presence actually provided cover, making it harder for anyone to suspect their activities. Meanwhile, their roles as dormitory supervisors gave them perfect access to victims. They could enter students' rooms at any hour, call boys to their quarters, and explain it all as legitimate supervisory duties. Understanding this context doesn't excuse their actions, but it does something more important. It highlights the urgent need for systemic change. When abuse victims become abusers, it's not just a personal failing. It's a sign that the system failed twice. First, it failed to protect them as children. Then, it failed to address their trauma, instead placing them in positions where they could harm others. The institution's failure to address abuse didn't just harm the initial victims, it created the conditions for those victims to victimize others, perpetrating a cycle that stretched across generations. When the news broke, public outrage erupted, but the reaction was complicated, revealing deep cultural tensions about abuse, gender, and accountability. This wasn't the first sexual abuse case in Indonesian religious schools, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Many cases involve girls told to obey their kiai and become their wives, with promises of a good life and even heaven in exchange for sex. When students resist, they're often dismissed or punished. In Trenggalek, East Java, 4 students revealed their teacher and his son had sexually abused them, part of more than 10 total victims. The abuse occurred during cleaning duty, when the teacher and son would rape them one by one. And despite this, parents continued sending their children to the same school. But public outrage intensified when people learned the victims in the Agam case were underage boys. Many demanded swift police action, while others questioned why authorities move so quickly when they rarely do so for female victims. Some pointed out the bitter irony. Finally, when male victims are involved, the system responds. Where was this urgency for the countless girls abused in pesantren? But regardless of the victim's gender, abuse is abuse. The question isn't which victims deserve faster justice, it's just why any abuse is allowed to continue at all. And the school's response raised eyebrows. Officials claimed they played a major role in the investigation, stating that 40 victims came forward due to their internal investigation, with police finding the remaining victims. They emphasized that of the victims, only 3 were sodomized while 37 experienced inappropriate touching, as if this distinction somehow lessened the severity of the trauma inflicted. The school contacted Child Protection Services and requested psychiatric help. Child protection advocates recommended that all victims undergo medical examinations to properly document the abuse and support the legal case. But everyone knew that with such deep psychological scars, recovery would take considerable time and effort. The trauma, especially for A, was severe. Merely hearing the school's name would cause him to break down. He ultimately chose to leave education entirely, focusing on recovery from his traumatic experience. But trauma wasn't the only burden these boys had to bear. When some victims felt ready to return to their studies, they faced a new nightmare: schools refusing to admit them. News had spread rapidly across the area, often embellished with unverified information. Schools rejected them under a cruel premise: a sexual abuse victim will eventually become a perpetrator themselves. Indah Sari Ramaini, a sociologist from Andalas University in West Sumatra, explained that this negative stigma is commonly applied to sexual abuse victims, especially in the Minangkabau area. Because of this stigma, victims feel constantly watched and judged, eventually losing their sense of identity. And this is why many victims choose to hide the truth, swallowing their trauma and enduring everything alone. The irony is crushing. Society fears that victims will become perpetrators, so they ostracize victims, denying them education and support, the very things that might help them heal and break the cycle they fear. So in a nutshell, this case shows us how abuse, when ignored, turns into something much worse. Male survivors are often dismissed or even feared as potential abusers, and that belief is wrong and harmful. Most victims never become perpetrators, but when trauma goes untreated, it can twist into deeper pain and, in rare cases, more harm. RA and AA were once victims themselves. They never got help or a path to healing. Their past does not excuse their crimes, but it shows what happens when abuse is buried instead of addressed. Protecting future victims starts with helping the ones we already have. In many pesantren, obedience to religious teachers and isolation from the outside world makes speaking out nearly impossible. When authority goes unquestioned, abuse can hide for years. Real safety means transparency, outside oversight, and accountability, no matter how respected someone is. And students need to know their bodies are their own and that they can report abuse without fear. Every survivor, male or female, deserves proper care and support. This will happen again until we fundamentally change how these institutions operate, unless we prioritize child safety over institutional reputation. And that is all for today. Thanks for watching.